Really interesting here. We know that Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and they confirmed yet again in Connecticut, New York, Rhode Island, and Wisconsin, that they will be their party's nominees. They also reminded us of the great weaknesses that they have both been experiencing on the campaign trail. I'm not just talking about age here. I'm not talking about Donald Trump's legal problems necessarily either, although it's interesting how some folks can read this. Donald Trump got 75% of the vote, at least in all of these states. But guess what? Someone named Nikki Haley got at least 10% of the vote in all 4 states. Remembering that phenomenon in Georgia, they said, well, listen, she hadn't dropped out yet. People were voting early. Well, here's another test. And for Joe Biden, at least 80% of the vote in each of these states, but the uncommitted ballot option gobbled up as much as 15% in some states. In Rhode Island, 14.9% uncommitted. And I wish we had more time with Jim Ellis, but I'm glad we've got a couple of minutes with a voice of experience from the campaign here. He's the president of Ellis Insight. Jim, great to have you back. How are you looking at these results now, knowing that Nikki Haley is out of this race?
Joe, thanks so much. It's good to be back with you. I think the votes would have been the same if the Republicans had a uncommitted choice as well. I think Nikki Haley was the only option on that ballot. And so both candidates have about 10 to 15% where they need to reach out to try to get back and have a fully united base going into the election. So it's not particularly surprising. And, these numbers for both are actually quite good. The interesting part, though, again, I've been studying the turnout in these primaries all across the nation. And last night, the 3 of the states, more Democrats voted, which you would expect from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and New York. But other states, in fact, we've had 32, where we've had both parties vote. And in 24 of the 32, we've seen more Republicans turn out in their primary than Democrats in theirs. And that shows sort of a lack of enthusiasm for Biden. And that's why you see his campaign moving further to the left on his message, because they need to unite that Democratic Party for turnout in November. And sometimes primary turnout is a precursor to what happens in the general elections. Yes. That's why I pay a lot of attention to it, and I think it's quite interesting right now.
Well, so there's no Nikki Haley for Joe Biden here. I don't think Dean Phillips is necessarily creating a protest vote. Of course, he's left the campaign as well. What is this uncommitted movement for Joe Biden equal to you? If there's a ceasefire in Israel, for instance, will we still see numbers like this?
Very hard to say. I think that Israel issue is the toughest one Biden has to deal with, because it seems like no matter what he does, he can't come out ahead politically. And so a lot of that uncommitted vote we're seeing in these primaries revolves around that Palestinian-Israel issue. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens here in the next few months, because it could be determinative in a lot of ways for the general election, simply because, particularly in states like Michigan and Minnesota, where you have a large Muslim population, Arab population that are responding negatively towards what Biden has been doing in Israel. And if that's the case, particularly in Michigan, that block of votes that voted almost solely with Biden in 2020, and if it doesn't come back for him this time, Michigan's going to be close enough where that could make a big difference. And so this is a very important issue and a very difficult one for Biden.
Donald Trump is trying to own the term bloodbath. And I wonder your thoughts on this. It's not an equivalency, but I remember when Joe Biden took the term Bidenomics, which was really just kind of a joke, or something that was written about in the Wall Street Journal. He tried to own it. Donald Trump's doing the same here now. In fact, they've launched a website, for crying out loud, called borderbloodbath.com or something. Remembering that remark upset a lot of people when he referred to it with a reference to the auto sector. We heard again, though, last evening about how immigrants crossing the border illegally, migrants are animals. He said they are not human beings. And I wonder, as you consider the challenge that Joe Biden is facing, for instance, with progressives on Israel, will Donald Trump face a challenge with this kind of trail of rhetoric that he's leaving once this does become a general election vote in November?
Well, once again, I guess it's Donald Trump being Donald Trump. And I think we're going to see a lot more of this. A lot of people think if he would just maybe change his rhetoric a little bit, that he would do a lot better. But it doesn't look like he'll ever do that. And obviously, he's trying to bring greater attention with this rhetoric to the problem we've got at the border, because now everybody's sort of saying, oh, this is a serious problem. You notice some Democrat ads, particularly in places like Arizona and Nevada. The Senator Jackie Rosen is just out with a new ad talking about how she stood up to her party on the border. I'm not sure when she did that, but that's what she's saying, and that she's for more border security. You've got Ruben Gallego, who will be the Democratic nominee for the Senate in Arizona, doing the same thing. I think the border issue, I really think in terms of a vote driver, it's one thing to be an important issue, it's another to be a vote driver. But in those particular states that border Mexico, that issue is going to be a driver. And I think we're seeing the campaigns already starting to respond to that. And that's what Trump's trying to do with this rhetoric. Whether or not that's going to engender more votes for him, that remains to be seen. But that's obviously what he's trying to do.
Well, it's funny, you're talking about actual border states. He was in Michigan making these remarks over the weekend here. And that has been a successful strategy for the former president, right? To make every state a border state, Jim.
It is, and that's what they tried to do in that New York special election when Santos was expelled.
Right.
And it really didn't work because that district voted as it was drawn. It was drawn as a lean Democratic seat. That's how it voted. And I think it's one thing to talk about the border in these border states. I think it's another thing where people do think it's important, but they don't see it as much when they're 2,000 miles away. And therefore, I think there's a big question. I think we learned this on the abortion issue in 2020. It's a big difference between what people say is an important issue to them and what is actually a vote driver. What will actually get you to go out to the vote, to vote on that particular issue. Abortion proved to be that for the Democrats. The Republicans are trying to make the border that for them. And I think that probably does work in those states we were talking about. But the further you get away from the border, I'm not sure it does, so we'll find out. But that's what Trump is trying to do, no doubt about it.
Always a fascinating conversation with Jim Ellis. It's good to see you, Jim. Ellis Insight is the firm. He is the president and founder. Of course, I'm Joe Matthew in Washington, and as promised, I'm going to be hearing from Jay Powell right now, the Fed chair.